Imagine waking up one morning, brewing your coffee and checking the news. You see that the US dollar, which was worth a certain amount yesterday, has now multiplied tenfold overnight. But your paycheck stays the same. You rush to the grocery store, but the prices on the shelves are changing literally before your eyes. A loaf of bread gets more expensive while you're standing in line. Your life savings, meant for a car or a down payment on a house, have evaporated into an amount that can't even buy you a new pair of shoes. This isn't a dystopian movie plot. This was the daily reality for millions of Germans in the early 1920s. We often hear that Hitler came to power because of the Great Depression in 1929, but the seeds of dictatorship were planted much earlier, in a time when money lost its value faster than it could be printed. Today, we're going to follow the chain of events that started with a financial catastrophe and ended in a totalitarian nightmare. We'll break down how the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany didn't just bankrupt its citizens, but tore apart the very fabric of society, paving the way for the most monstrous regime in modern history. Let's start at the very beginning. Why did this insane inflation happen in Germany in the first place? The answer lies at the end of World War I. Germany lost, and the victors, primarily France and Britain, decided Germany had to pay for the destruction. So they imposed reparations. The sum was astronomical, 132 billion gold marks. It was an impossible burden for a country already shattered by war. To understand the scale, imagine a college student working a part-time job suddenly getting a bill for $1 billion. They can't pay it. Neither could Germany. But it tried. How? The government turned on the printing presses. Instead of raising taxes or cutting spending, which would have been politically painful, they just started producing more and more money that wasn't backed by anything of real value. A concrete example? Let's take the story of Friedrich Schmidt, an ordinary schoolteacher. In 1918, he was a respected man. His life savings, set aside for a rainy day, were 20,000 marks, enough to buy a small house. Just 4 years later, by the end of 1922, those 20,000 marks weren't worth a box of matches. His lifelong savings had turned to dust. And he wasn't a speculator. He was a decent, hard-working citizen. The takeaway from this first part is simple. When a government tries to solve its financial problems by mindlessly printing money, it always ends in disaster for ordinary people. Money loses its value, and with it, people lose trust in the state that allowed such a collapse. And this shattered trust is the first building block in the foundation of a future dictatorship, because desperate people look for a strong hand. But what was happening on the streets, in everyday life? It was economic surrealism. People started getting paid daily, sometimes twice a day. Why? Because by the evening, the money could be worth half as much. Factory workers would send their children or wives running to the market with their pay the second they got it, to buy food before prices shot up again. People stopped using wallets. They carried money in wheelbarrows and bundles. Kids played with stacks of banknotes because the paper itself was more valuable than the denomination. People wallpapered their rooms with money. There's the famous story of a man who left a suitcase full of cash unattended. When he returned, the suitcase was stolen, but the money was scattered on the ground. It wasn't worth the effort to carry it away. The conclusion here is even more frightening. Hyperinflation didn't just make people poor. It demoralized society. It turned all moral principles upside down. Thrift, hard work, planning for the future, all of it became meaningless. The ones who survived weren't those who worked honestly, but those who speculated quickly, guessed exchange rates, and were unprincipled. Society split into bitter poor and a handful of cynical nouveau riches who profited from the chaos. It was in this atmosphere of universal fear, anger, and humiliation that a demand for a saviour was born. People craved order, stability, and most dangerously, someone to blame. And this brings us to our third part. How this chaos opened the door for a specific man with specific promises. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party didn't appear out of thin air. They were a product of this decay. In his speeches in Munich beer halls, Hitler spoke a language every embittered German understood. He didn't talk about complex economic theories. He pointed fingers. Who was to blame? It was those who imposed the reparations international Jewish financiers and the traitors in their own government, the November criminals, who signed the shameful armistice. His rhetoric was the perfect medicine for a humiliated nation. He promised not just economic recovery, he promised a revival of national pride, a cleansing of subversives, and most importantly, a strong hand that would bring order to the chaos. The middle class, ruined by inflation, the small shopkeepers, the craftsmen, the pensioners, they all saw in him someone who would sweep away the old, unjust system. A concrete example, November 1923, the peak of hyperinflation. $1 was worth 2 trillion marks. At this very moment, Hitler made his first, still unsuccessful attempt to seize power, the Beer Hall Putsch. The putsch failed, but the trial against Hitler made him a national figure. He used the process as a platform to spread his ideas to all of Germany. The chaos was working in his favour. The takeaway from this part is clear. Economic collapse, especially a traumatic one like hyperinflation, creates the perfect breeding ground for extremists. When people lose faith in democratic institutions that fail to protect them, they turn to those who offer simple, even if radical, solutions and scapegoats. So what do we do with this today? The lessons of Weimar Germany aren't just pages from a history textbook. They are a direct warning. Stability is fragile. Trust in money and in the state is absolutely fundamental. When that foundation crumbles, the whole society can fall apart. We aren't living in an era of hyperinflation, but we constantly hear about rising prices, national debt problems, and central banks using tools likened to printing money to fight crises. The story of Weimar teaches us to be vigilant. It teaches us that the economy isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about people's lives. It's about social peace. And it's ultimately about the safety and future of the entire world. So my call to action for you today is very simple. Don't be apathetic about the economy. Be interested not only in the prices at the grocery store, but also in what your Treasury Secretary is saying, what policy the Federal Reserve is pursuing. Read, ask questions, demand accountability from those who manage our financial system, because the price of indifference, as Germany's history showed, can be truly horrifying. It can lead to dictatorship, war, and millions of deaths. Thanks for watching. If this made you think, please share it with a friend. Let's discuss this crucial topic in the comments. What do you think? Can we be sure something like this will never happen again?